You think you can fly this? Prove it or get out.
Deal. Watch me soar.
In the bustling heart of Atlanta, Georgia, where the humid southern air clung to everything like an old memory, the private aviation center at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport hummed with the quiet luxury of the elite. It was a place where deals worth millions were sealed over glasses of aged bourbon, and the scent of polished leather and jet fuel mixed with the faint aroma of magnolias from the nearby grounds. On this warm evening in late summer, a group of high-powered businessmen and women had gathered for an exclusive preview of the latest in private aviation, the sleek Gulfstream G650, a marvel of engineering priced at a cool $25 million. The jet gleamed under the floodlights, its fuselage a promise of speed and escape from the everyday grind. Edward Harrington, a silver-haired real estate magnate in his late 50s, stood at the center of it all. Heir to a sprawling empire of commercial properties across the Southeast, Edward was the kind of man who wore his wealth like a badge of honor-tailored suits from Savile Row, a gold Rolex that caught the light just so, and a laugh that boomed like thunder over the chatter. He'd flown in from his penthouse in Buckhead that afternoon, eager to eye the new toy that could whisk him to his vacation home in the Hamptons in under 4 hours. But as the sales presentation droned on, Edward's attention wandered to a figure that didn't quite fit the polished scene. She was an older black woman, perhaps in her early 60s, standing quietly at the edge of the group. Her name was Evelyn Harper, though no one there knew it yet. Dressed in a threadbare coat that had seen better days and clutching a faded canvas tote bag, she looked every bit the outsider amid the sea of designer labels and diamond cufflinks. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, streaked with gray, and her face bore the lines of a life hard-lived, deep furrows around her eyes from squinting into sunrises and sunsets alike. Evelyn had wandered into the center earlier that evening, drawn by the familiar roar of engines and the sight of the aircraft through the open hangar doors. It reminded her of simpler times, back when flying was more than a luxury. It was her calling. Edward spotted her first, his eyes narrowing in amusement as she stepped closer to peer into the cockpit window. "Well, now," he drawled, his voice carrying that thick Georgia accent laced with condescension. "Looks like we've got a stray in the henhouse. Darlin', you sure you're in the right place? This ain't the Greyhound station." The words hung in the air like smoke from a barbecue pit, and a ripple of laughter spread through the group. A few of the men fellow tycoons from Atlanta's business district chuckled into their whiskey glasses, while the women exchanged knowing glances, their pearl necklaces glinting under the lights. The sales representative, a sharp-dressed woman named Laura Bennett in her 40s, shifted uncomfortably. She'd organized this event for Atlanta's wealthiest, and the last thing she needed was a scene. Discreetly, she signaled to the security guard lurking in the shadows. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She stood there, her dark eyes fixed on the instrument panel inside the Gulfstream, as if the mockery was just background noise from a distant storm. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of gripping controls that no one in that room could imagine, tightened slightly on her bag. Edward, emboldened by the laughter, sauntered over, gesturing grandly at the jet. "Tell you what, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'll give you this bird right here if you can fly it. How's that sound? One little spin around the runway, and it's all yours." More guffaws erupted, the kind that echoed off the hangar walls like ricocheting bullets. Richard Caldwell, a burly investor from Savannah with a penchant for cigars, pulled out his phone to start recording. "This is gold," he muttered to his wife, who smirked behind her manicured hand. "Viral material for sure. Homeless lady thinks she's Top Gun." But Evelyn's expression didn't crack. Instead, she murmured something under her breath, her voice steady as the Georgia red clay. 45 years, she said, loud enough now for the laughter to falter just a bit. Edward paused, his smirk widening. "What's that? 45 years since you last rode the bus." The crowd howled again, but Evelyn turned to face him squarely, her gaze unwavering. 45 years flying, sir. That's what I said." The hangar fell into a stunned hush for a split second before the laughter exploded anew, louder this time, like a dam breaking. Edward doubled over, slapping his knee. "Flying? Oh, Lord have mercy. That's the best one yet. As if you've ever been higher than coach on a Delta flight." Whispers rippled through the group, some uncomfortable, others reveling in the spectacle. Laura edged closer to Evelyn, whispering, "Ma'am, maybe it's best if you—" But Evelyn held up a hand, her calm demeanor cutting through the noise like a knife through butter. "If you're so certain I can't fly it," Evelyn said, her voice clear and measured, carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd faced worse storms than this. "Why not make it official? Put your money where your mouth is, Mr. Harrington." The words landed like a gauntlet thrown in a duel. Edward blinked, caught off guard. The man who prided himself on always having the upper hand suddenly felt the ground shift beneath his polished loafers. The guests exchanged glances. Was this woman, this apparent vagrant, really challenging one of Atlanta's most powerful men in front of potential buyers? Edward recovered quickly, his face reddening. "You got guts, I'll give you that. All right, fine. If you can taxi this beauty out and take her up for a proper loop safely, mind you, I'll sign her over right here. But if you crash and burn, which you will, I want you on your knees apologizing to every soul in this room for wasting our time. And you'll cover the damages out of whatever pocket change you've got." The terms were brutal, laced with the kind of casual cruelty that spoke volumes about privilege unchecked. Murmurs of disapproval rose from a few corners. Old-timer Harlan Whitaker, a retired banker from Decatur, shook his head slowly, sensing something amiss. But the bet was struck, and the air thickened with anticipation. Evelyn nodded once, her eyes never leaving the Gulf Stream. "Deal. And when I do it, you'll honor your word, no backing out." Edward laughed, but it rang hollow now, forced. As Evelyn approached the aircraft, she began a methodical inspection, her movements precise and ingrained, like muscle memory from a lifetime of rituals. She checked the tires for wear, examined the ailerons and flaps with a practiced eye, peered into the engine intakes. "Pre-flight checklist," she said softly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Control surfaces clear, hydraulics nominal, fuel levels optimal." Richard's phone kept rolling, but his smirk had faded. This wasn't the fumbling amateur he'd expected. Laura, the sales rep, pulled Evelyn aside for a moment, her voice low. "Ma'am, this is serious. Harrington's not bluffing. One mistake, and—" Evelyn smiled faintly, a warmth in her eyes that spoke of battles long won. "I've flown through worse than a hotshot's ego, honey. Started back in 1980, when folks like me weren't even supposed to dream of the skies. But I did, and I will again." Laura's eyes widened. 1980? That would make her a pioneer in an era when aviation was a white man's world, especially for black women in the South. But before she could process it, Evelyn was climbing the steps to the cockpit. Inside, the leather seats and glowing panels enveloped her like an old friend. She settled into the pilot's seat, her hands moving with the grace of a symphony conductor. The engines whirred to life with a deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the hangar. Edward's face paled as Evelyn's voice crackled over the internal speakers. "Tower, Gulfstream Golf, Charlie, 7 requesting clearance for taxi and demo flight. 15 minutes, airtime." The response came swift and professional. "Gulfstream Golf, Charlie, 7, cleared. Welcome back to the pattern, Captain Harper." "Captain," Edward sputtered, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "What in tarnation?" Laura, fumbling with her tablet, typed frantically into a search engine. Her face drained of color as the results loaded. "Oh my God," she whispered, turning the screen to the group. "Evelyn Harper, commercial airline captain, first black woman to captain transatlantic routes for Delta out of Atlanta. 45 years in the air, over 38,000 hours logged. She saved 187 souls in a turbulent emergency diversion over the Atlantic in 1995. Congressional Medal of Honor for Civilian Aviation. Retired just last year as a senior instructor at the FAA Training Center in Peachtree City." The hangar erupted in gasps. Harlan Whitaker leaned on his cane, muttering, "Well, I'll be damned." Richard's recording captured it, all the stunned faces, the engines spooling up. Evelyn's voice continued over the radio, calm as a summer breeze. "Mr. Harrington, you bet on appearance, not ability. But ability's what gets you home safe." The jet taxied out smoothly, the crowd spilling onto the tarmac to watch. Edward, sweating now despite the cooling night air, shouted into a handheld radio, "Stop. This is a mistake. I didn't know." But it was too late. The Gulfstream accelerated down the runway, lifting off with a grace that silenced even the skeptics. For 15 heart-pounding minutes, Evelyn put on a clinic, tight spirals around the airport perimeter, a flawless touch-and-go landing simulation, and a climb to 10,000 feet that showcased the jet's Mach 0.925 cruise speed. From the ground, it was mesmerizing, a dance of precision against the starry Georgia sky. Harlan wiped a tear from his eye, whispering to his wife, "That's real flying, right there. Reminds me of the old Tuskegee days." When the wheels kissed the runway again, softer than a whisper, the applause was thunderous. Evelyn taxied back, shutting down the engines with the same effortless poise. She emerged from the cockpit, stepping down the stairs like she'd just finished a routine shift. Edward was on his knees by then, not in triumph, but in utter defeat, his suit rumpled and his face ashen. The man who'd built skyscrapers now looked small against the shadow of the jet. Evelyn approached him slowly, holding out the keys. "You can keep your plane, Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice steady but kind. "I never came here for it. I just wanted you to see that judging a book by its cover can blind you to the story inside. 45 years ago, I fought for my wings in a world that said I didn't belong. Tonight, you learned why that fight matters." Edward looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Why didn't you tell us from the start?" "Because," Evelyn replied, "if I had, you'd have fawned over me like some celebrity, and then the lesson wouldn't stick. Folks like you need to feel the sting of your own words to change." Laura rushed forward, tears streaming. "Captain Harper, we're so sorry." We all." Evelyn patted her shoulder. "You saw it now. That's the start." Word of the incident spread like wildfire through Atlanta's social circles that very night. Richard's video, titled something innocuous at first, exploded online, over 20 million views in the first week alone. Hashtags like aviation legend and don't judge a book trended nationwide, sparking debates on morning talk shows from CNN to local Georgia public broadcasting. Edward's world crumbled fast. His real estate firm lost a $10 million deal with a progressive investment group in Midtown who cited his demonstrated lack of character in pulling out. Partners from Charlotte and Birmingham distanced themselves, whispering about the old boy's outdated views clashing with the new South. By month's end, he was forced to liquidate 2 of his private jets to cover legal fees from a wrongful humiliation suit that Evelyn graciously declined to pursue, but the damage was done. Edward, once the king of boardrooms, found himself attending mandatory diversity seminars, his arrogance humbled into quiet reflection. For the others, the night marked a turning point. Laura Bennett earned a promotion to vice president of sales for the aviation firm, her quick thinking in documenting Evelyn's credentials turning the event into a corporate training video on unconscious bias. She often shared the story at industry conferences, emphasizing how one overlooked individual could upend an entire room's assumptions. Harlan Whitaker, the old banker, donated a hefty sum to the local chapter of the Negro Airmen International, inspired to support scholarships for aspiring black pilots. "That woman," he told his grandchildren over Sunday dinner, "taught me more about flying high than any cockpit ever could." Evelyn Harper's life, meanwhile, took flight in ways she hadn't anticipated. Invitations poured in, from speaking at the annual Air and Space Museum Gala in Washington, D.C., to keynoting at Emory University's Aviation Symposium. Young women, especially black girls from Atlanta's inner-city neighborhoods, lined up to hear her tale, their eyes wide with possibility. "I started in 1980, she'd say, her voice warm with memory, when the skies were no place for someone like me. But I carved out my space, one flight at a time. And you can too." The hangar where it all unfolded was repurposed into the Evelyn Harper Aviation Academy, funded by a mix of private donations and federal grants for underrepresented communities. There, under the same lights that once illuminated mockery, students learned pre-flight checks and dreamed of their own wings. 6 months later, as fall leaves turned the Georgia landscape to gold, Evelyn stood at the Academy's dedication ceremony. The Gulfstream G650 parked nearby as a symbolic exhibit. Edward was there too, uninvited but showing up anyway, his posture straighter but his eyes humbled. He approached her quietly, extending a hand. "Captain Harper," he said, his voice gruff but sincere, "I was wrong. Dead wrong. Thank you for the lesson." Evelyn shook his hand firmly. Lessons aren't free, Mr. Harrington, but they're worth every penny. The crowd cheered, and for the first time, Edward joined in not as the center of attention, but as a man who'd learned to listen. In the end, that night in the Atlanta hangar wasn't just about a bet or a flight. It was a reckoning for a society still grappling with the shadows of its past. Evelyn Harper emerged not as a victim of prejudice, but as its conqueror, proving that true power lies not in wealth or status, but in the unyielding strength of character forged through adversity. Edward Harrington, once blind to the humanity around him, spent his remaining days advocating quietly for fair housing initiatives in Atlanta's underserved districts, a small redemption for a man who'd flown too close to the sun of his own ego. In the Gulfstream, it became the Academy's star trainer, carrying new generations into the skies where Evelyn had once soared alone. What a story of triumph over ignorance, right? But let's talk about the bigger picture, hear the raw underbelly of injustice, and the subtle violence of words that cut deeper than any fist. In a world where folks still get judged, dismissed, or worse based on the color of their skin or the clothes on their back, stories like Evelyn's hit hard. They remind us that systemic bias isn't ancient history. It's alive in boardrooms, hangars, and everyday encounters. I want to hear from you in the comments. What's your take on this kind of everyday violence, the kind that erodes dignity without leaving a bruise? Do you stand with calling out privilege like Edwards, or do you think forgiveness comes too easy? Share your stance, your own experiences, or how you've seen injustice play out in your life. Let's spark a real conversation. Your voice matters in pushing back against it all.